And welcome to this one-on-one here on Tealtown, USA. I am Eric Cura, and pleased to be joined by a good friend of mine and the Sharks radio play-by-play voice, Dan Rusanowsky. Dan, good to see you.
Hi, Eric.
How have you been during this whole quarantine process?
Well, I've been great actually, but of course, obviously a little bit stir crazy because we can't do what we love. But I think that's hopefully seeing some signs of coming to an end now. Although for the Sharks, it's going to be a little while before there's another hockey game played. But I think that we're all looking forward to resuming the NHL this year when it ever happens, and also getting together at the start of training camp for next year.
Can't wait. I can't wait for the this new 2014 format to go, and then of course definitely getting back to the Shark Tank later this year would be wonderful. But let's begin with this season that has passed. The 2019-20 season for the Sharks has officially come to a close. It was a tough year, but what are the bright spots that fans can look back at for 2021?
Well, I was looking, in fact, I was just talking to one of the bright spots today, Mario Ferraro, who I think had a really nice rookie campaign. He was one of the guys that the Sharks were counting on to step up and be ready for the NHL. I think he showed that he had as seamless a transition as I've seen from college hockey to the NHL that the Sharks have ever had. Joe Pavelski probably being another candidate for that. But even he spent a little bit of time in the American Hockey League at the early stage of his career. So you could say that Ferraro has one up on Joe for that, only on a small basis, but still you have to be impressed with that. And I think that was one of the things to be excited about. Another, the captaincy of Logan Couture, how he's done a really good job of being a leader of the team. It took him a little while. That C was a little bit heavy at the start of the year, not because it was anything that he wasn't ready for, just because of the sheer responsibility of it all. And I think that the Sharks showed at least that they have the building blocks to be a great team for a number of seasons. It just didn't work out last year. And I think that that's something that they're going to be top of mind on when it comes to being motivated to start for training camp and getting ready. And the good news is that the extended time will allow them to train, to heal properly from some of the tough injuries. We talked to Tomas Hertl this morning, too, and he mentioned that the progress on his surgeries have gone really well. So he expects to be ready to go at the start of the year. And same thing with Erik Karlsson, although his injury wasn't quite as serious as Hertl's, still a very tough one when you've got a thumb injury and your skill is handling the puck.
Yeah, hopefully with the extended time off that the Sharks will enjoy, they will get everybody well rested and healthy, ready to go. So when the puck does drop for I guess it's the 30th anniversary season, they'll be 100% and ready to go.
Yeah, 30 years, amazing, isn't it, Eric? It was seemed like it was yesterday when it was all just starting, and the team was playing in the Cow Palace, and the SAP Center was just a hole in the ground being constructed. All of those things just sort of flood back as I consider the options of 30 years with Sharks hockey.
It's crazy to think 30 years. Oh my goodness. Well, you've done a few podcasts with the Sharks alumni in the 1991 club. From all those, and I remember you had Teemu Selanne and Ray Whitney, one of my favorites, among others. What are some stories that you've been able to hear from former Sharks on?
Well, one of the unanimous things that I've been getting is just how proud all of these guys are to really be Sharks alumni. And that really warms my heart. The idea that Ray Whitney began his career in the NHL here, really had most of his success with other teams. He first became a 30-goal scorer with Florida, won the Stanley Cup in Carolina, and played for his hometown Edmonton Oilers for a while, played in Detroit for the Red Wings, Columbus, forget about those years, but and of course in Arizona, where he's living these days as he's working with the NHL. But that's just one example. Jeff Odgers, I had a great chat with him about his times with San Jose. And it's just great to reconnect with all of these guys. But the thing, as I said, that jumps out at me, Eric, is how proud they are of the Sharks, how proud they are to be part of the organization, and how that term Sharks for Life really does resonate with them. And I think that's great.
And you always hear, even though like you said with Whitney, who bounced around the league, and the same with Odgers, but there's always that little synonymous with the Sharks. So it's great to hear that they revert back to some of their days in San Jose. Um,
Well, sure, and even Teemu Solani, who's admittedly much more identified with the Anaheim Ducks than he is with the Sharks, he spoke very, very favorably about the time that he spent with the Sharks and had some fun times and some heartbreaking times in the playoffs, but some great moments on the ice. And so, even for a player that is identified more with another team, the thoughts about the Sharks are great. And I haven't talked to him yet in this series, but Igor Larionov would probably be another one like that because he's more associated now with the Red Wings, even though he was such a huge part of the Sharks beating the Red Wings that
oh,
very first season. So I know that all these guys feel that way about the team. And again, as I said, it warms my heart.
yeah, I will never ever ever forget that 1994 run. It was just so magical. Just seeing everybody in a sea of teal in San Jose was just amazing. But speaking of
It's where it
stories,
all started.
yeah, no, and that's where I think the major love affair came in. You had the Cow Palace for a few years, and everybody fell in love. But then when they came to San Jose, it just blossoms big time. Speaking of stories, you mentioned your book, If These Walls Could Talk, that you wrote with Ross McEwen. Uh, there were many stories, and just going through just triggered back so many memories. What were the
Just so happen to have a copy of it right here. If anybody wants to get it on Amazon, they're still definitely available, and it's a fun read. I
de-
hope.
definitely, I highly recommend it. It was just triggered back so many memories. But what were your highlights putting the book together? And or are there any stories behind the scenes that you could possibly share?
Well, Ross McEwen and I used to talk at 9 o'clock every night for a couple of months. Well, not every night, but 5 nights a week anyway, where we would go over some of the things we were working on together. And he focused on a few little items, and I focused on some others. And then we put it all together. That was a really fun process. I think the best part of it was realizing how many things we had forgotten, and that's the other thing. You remember pieces of it, and then the other person talks about their memories of it, and then you recall something that happened. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Probably a good example of that occurred when the Sharks beat the Red Wings. We really didn't know exactly where we were going to go after the game was over, and we had checked out of the hotel already. We wound up at a motel at the airport waiting to see which way the team was going to fly because the problem is that they were dependent on the end of the Vancouver Calgary game. That was another game 7 that was played that night, and that one went into multiple overtimes. I
Hmm.
remember it as a triple overtime, and Pavel Bure got the game winner for
Right.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
So we were sitting around. There was a pool table. I remember that really well. And the guys were playing pool, just waiting for all this to happen. We had some sandwiches delivered for the guys. It was really kind of a chaotic situation because we couldn't go back to the hotel because we had checked out and they'd already booked it for some other event in Detroit. And I got a funny feeling that nobody in Detroit would have been too happy to see us anyway. So here we were sitting there waiting to go. And the thought was, well, if Calgary wins, we turn left and go to Calgary. And if Vancouver wins, we turn right and go to Toronto. It's going to be an interesting round number 2. And the game just kept dragging on and on and on. We finally got the news that Pavel Bure had scored that goal. So that meant we were turning right and going to Toronto. By that time, it was so late that we just got rooms at the motel and stayed over and woke up the next morning at the airport and went out to the plane and flew into Toronto, into that maelstrom.
Oh
But
man.
there were a couple of other stories surrounding that came up that were just fun memories. And even a crazy thing like this, where the Sharks were part of a couple of canceled games that were regularly scheduled. Now, you get that in Major League Baseball when you have a rainout, but hockey, we had a snowout, which is amazing. It was in Vancouver. We were flying from
Oh
Calgary to
yeah.
Vancouver, and they told us that they were going to close the airport. We had to decide right then whether we were going to go or not. And Al Sims, the coach of the team at the time, said, "Let's go. We're going to go there, and they're going to find a way to play the game. I've been through this before." Well, We were the last plane allowed to be land in Vancouver, and I remember that the next day, and it was another memory that just sort of came back, that somebody was skiing up Robson Street, which is
Oh
a real
wow.
major street in Toronto
Hmm.
in Vancouver, and people were cross country skiing that day. There was absolutely nowhere to get food, nothing. So the game got canceled. We ended up waiting until we could fly out and then flying home. There was another one like that too, where we had a it was the day that Dean Lombardi was replaced by Doug Wilson. Actually, that didn't happen the same day, but the day that Dean was dismissed as the GM of the Sharks, we were flying to Colorado, and we were on our way, and we had to land in Colorado Springs because the airports were closed,
Hmm.
and we had usually it takes, I don't know, what, 90 minutes to go from Colorado Springs to Denver, if you had to do that. And it took us over 3 hours, and it was
Oh,
one of the bumpiest rides I've ever been on. Kind of dangerous, but that's another one of the little travel stories that I remembered when we were just sort of composing all of this. And little things like that happen. Craig Cox losing all of his money in a poker game during a flight delay. Going out to Hartford, that very first long road trip. Paul Fenton actually passing out. It's kind of interesting because he's had some health problems in recent years. And they were traceable to an irregularity in his heartbeat electronically. And I'm
wow.
always wondering that maybe that was the first sign of it. And they examined him; nothing was wrong. But little things like that you remember, and that with some sad memories too. So many over the course of the years. We've lost a couple of members of our team due to death over the course of the last 30 years. And I remember, when Mike Coleman, who played for the Sharks at the Cow Palace, was killed in a car crash in Kansas City. That was a terrible day. And it just so happened, Ray Whitney told me the other day in our conversation that that was the same day that Dean Lombardi was in San Diego signing him to an NHL contract. So it was kind of a bittersweet day because
Mm.
of all of the terrible. Oh, you know what? I got that wrong. It wasn't Mike Coleman. It was when Link Gates got into his car crash the same day he signed Ray Whitney. But I remember things like that happened over the course of time, and see how it all kind of melds together. Well, you always remember those folks too that are no longer with us, and of course we remember them dearly.
Yeah, definitely. And there's just so many memories. Good times, rough times, and I'll never forget the rain out in 1995 in downtown San Jose.
That
Uh,
was the flood out, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah, where it flooded around the arena, and it was, if I'm not mistaken, it's still like the only rain out in NHL history, if I'm not mistaken.
It's the only one that I know of,
Yeah,
but I can tell you that if you go to Henry's High Life, which many Sharks fans do, there's still a marker at the high point of the water, and if you go there and look at it, you'll be amazed at how high that water actually got. I'm amazed it didn't get a lot worse. I know that in Calgary they had flooding, and it actually did some damage to the Saddle Dome, but I don't recall if there were any NHL games that were scheduled that were canceled. I don't think that was the case because I think it was preseason. But
yeah.
but that's the only other time I can remember something like that happening.
It's crazy. I don't think Guadalupe River was as it was today to handle that for
But
sure.
remember, the Army Corps of Engineers hadn't finished their project,
Right.
and so it used to flood every year, and it was worse some years than the others back in the old days. But the Army Corps was working on rediverting that and making it so that it is the way it is now, which is more flood controlled. So we're not going to have that situation again, at least according to the way that they've engineered it. But boy, that was some time.
Yeah. It was just crazy. And I was like, they playing inside. How can we not play hot? But it's one of those crazy weather stories that's in Sharks folklore for forever.
Forever.
Yeah. So I've also been enjoying, and I've been loving the classic radio broadcasts that we've had on during the NHL pause. It had been years since I heard the first game when you called the first ever Sharks game in Pacific Coliseum against the Vancouver Canucks on October 4th, 1991. Take me back to that day, which for you, I mean, the dream became real to become an NHL broadcaster.
Well, that's exactly what it was. It was it's a day I'll never forget. It was kind of like walking on air all day. It was just so exciting, not just for me personally, but for the team. It was the first game in the history of a brand new franchise in the National Hockey League, and here we were in a great city in Canada, so there was a lot of attention on what was going on. The game was not televised to the Bay Area, and part of the reason for that was they were doing 55 games, a package of that number of games that season. And now I know that many people that are used to having every game on TV, it wasn't like that back in the old days.
Right.
So they decided that it was more important and maybe a little more cost effective to actually televise the next night, which was also against Vancouver at the Cow Palace, because that represented the first game in the NHL played in the Bay Area since 1976. So I think that the thinking was to televise that and have the whole spectacle of all of the opening night ceremonies and everything else that happened. And of course, having it be in the Bay Area. So what that meant was that the first game in Sharks history would only be broadcast on the radio to the Bay Area, which I'm particularly proud of. So that's one of the reasons why Dennis Hull was definitely with me, because the way that it worked back then is that there was a color commentator that worked with the television announcer, Joe Starkey, and then I would get a color commentator when that wasn't the case and when it was a radio only game. So I got Dennis for 25 games, and Joe got him, or Randy Hahn, who did some of the games
Right.
that year, for the rest. And the interesting thing is, we haven't aired this one yet because I've got to make sure I've got the complete tape. But the first game at the Cow Palace, Randy actually did color commentary with me because, again, Dennis Hull moved over to TV. Randy was in town. And so his first actual appearance for Sharks broadcast was with me that very second night. And I was listening to part of the game that I had, and I forgot that there was actually a broken pane of glass, and it was a brief timeout to wait to find the new pane of glass. And I remember that happened to me a couple times in my career, but I had forgotten that it happened the first night at the Cow Palace. And the only reason why I remember it now is because it was on tape.
Wow. A couple of things there is that Randy makes his Sharks debut on the radio with you, and
Mm-hmm.
then I do remember that. I do remember that opening night and how I think it was a photography hole that kind of got shattered in that glass, and that's
That
what
sounds right.
was causing the issue for it. So, yeah, though, oh man, you're bringing back so many great memories from the Cow Palace. I was fortunate to go to just two games when I was just a wee little tykester, but I was listening. I had my little red Sony Walkman listening to, I think it was KNEW at the time.
That's right.
Um,
AM 910.
yep,
The
and
frequency's there, the radio station isn't.
yeah, that's for darn sure.
Different programming these days.
Yes, definitely.
Back then, their theme was fun, sharks, and great country music. That was a good memory. Tom Benner did the mornings, Frank Terry did the middays, and Bill Collins did the afternoons. And that was always fun to listen to all that.
There were fun times even then when you jumped over to KFRC. That's where you guys picked up the Sharks picked up Joe Ike as the PA announcer, and it just flashbacks going through my mind right now. I gotta ask, what's is there one game that always sticks in your mind as like that's one of the greatest, or if not the greatest? I mean, there's a lot to choose from now in nearly 30 seasons.
There are, but I think that there's one that's eclipsed them all, and you know what that one is. That's Game 7 against Vegas. That'll never be repeated again as long as I live in the way that it happened.
Right.
To me, that was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had to be part of that and to call that game for the listeners. But there's so many others. The first game was obviously a big one. Jonas Donskoy scoring in overtime in the Stanley Cup final. Actually, in many respects, the game in Pittsburgh, Game 5, was even more remarkable because Martin Jones was amazing in the nets. The Sharks absolutely had to have the victory there and got it in Game number 5. And it was under pretty adverse circumstances in that the entire city of Pittsburgh seemed to be outside the building. They had
Yes.
big screens set up and everything else. As is the case in the Stanley Cup final, we had a police escort to go into the building and out just to make sure the traffic was controlled, and that was kind of cool. But realistically, that's another big one. And Game 7 against Calgary in '95. We just replayed that one on our Classic Sharks broadcast on the stream. Ray Whitney getting the double overtime goal. And as I mentioned in our conversation with him for the '91 club, he, as an Edmonton native, feels that that's one of the high points of his career because of how many people in Edmonton said you never had to buy a drink in town again after that one because you
Of
did something
course.
against Calgary. That's just so funny, a little thing like that. We used to see that rivalry play out in so many different ways. One way would be you'd pick up a copy of the Calgary Sun newspaper, tabloid, and you'd open up a story, and it would be a story with an Edmonton dateline. So the Calgary Sun would have an Edmonton dateline, and there was always a terrible story, like murder, death, robbery, rape, whatever. And then they would put another story right next to it with a Calgary dateline that was nice and warm and sunny. Well, then you go to Edmonton and pick up an Edmonton Sun, and it was exactly the opposite. All the Edmonton stories are really good next to a Calgary one that was terrible. It was really something.
So the Battle of Alberta just it goes beyond Oilers and Flames. Heck, even I guess Eskimos and Stampeders. Even the newspapers get into it. That's crazy.
Well, here's another story for you. So when they were cleaning up the Saddle Dome after those flood problems we were talking about, I was listening to a couple of guys that worked in the building talking about it. And the old story is that in Calgary, that's where the corporate headquarters are, right? So it's a kind of a corporate town, a little more white collar. And in Edmonton, even though there's certainly some of that, it's a lot of like blue collar oil guys, right?
Right.
So they were sitting there talking about it, and this one gentleman was saying something to the effect of, "Well, we know where all the real work gets done," and he was talking about cleaning up the Saddle Dome, and I leaned in and I said, "You mean Edmonton?" There was this silence, and they were staring at me for 5 seconds. So it definitely goes beyond the hockey team. I think that the hockey rivalry is a reflection of life, and we see that in other respects too. When you talk about the Beat LA chants that we have at SAP Center,
Right.
it's bigger than just the Sharks against the Kings or the Giants against the Dodgers or the A's against the Angels. It's a regional rivalry, which makes it fun, makes it exciting, and I think that accentuating some of those differences and building up the rivalry makes it even more worthwhile.
Yeah. No, it makes it fun. I mean, as long as we don't get too crazy about it, it makes it fun. For sure. Switching over to, I guess, the virtual side of things, on the one of the last big road trips of the season, you did the virtual road trip, um, where the game was just exclusively on the app or online. What was your take from it? And do we kind of see a little bit more of this down the road?
You'll probably see some additional things like that. I mean, we're seeing a reflection of it now with the historic broadcast that we're streaming out. That's a good way to get additional content out to our so many fans around the world, and to do that in a way that's easily accessible.
Right.
It's not the exact same as terrestrial radio, and there's always a place for that, in my opinion, too. But but it was really quite an experience. And I think one of the things that we were able to do was to get some of the additional content, have some extended pre-games and extended post-games
Nice.
in the instances where we weren't traveling, and to experiment with that a little bit and to see how traffic came to the app and exactly what that was able to accomplish. And I think it was a pretty worthwhile experiment. It's something that we're going to continue to do, and certainly to supplement everything that we're doing on normal radio and television. I think it was a pretty interesting experience.
Yep. No, I think it went really well. Although at the same time, I am always looking forward to a radio broadcast with when I'm definitely not near a television, but like to hear you call games. And well, finally, there's one happening when we record this. There's a virtual game day tonight. How has it been to call a virtual game? What is the process to call it, and how much does it differ from calling a live hockey game?
Well, it's definitely different because they're not real people, and in fact, I'm actually calling the names of some fans that are participating, and the game that you're referencing, depending on when people hear this, as we're recording this, this will be tonight, a virtual game between Sharks alumni and fans and the Quebec Nordiques alumni. That
Oh,
one's going to be
nice.
cool. And so it's interesting, first of all, to see some of the great players that played for the other teams over the course of time. We did a game against Detroit, and here I am calling Alex Delvecchio's name for the Detroit Red Wings, and he played there for 25 years, but retired when I was pretty young. So it was interesting to see that. Gordie Howe scored a goal, that kind of a thing. So it gave me the sort of opportunity to recreate some of those great games that I remember seeing some of these guys play. But also, it's a great way to interact with the fan base, and I think it keeps everybody's spirits up. We've done some live interviews after games, and that's been fun with the fans that are participating. So that was great to hear a little bit more about them and how they got hooked in with the Sharks, but also to find out that how many fans there are around the world. They're from everywhere. And I think that that's what's really neat to do that experience. It is definitely different because it's, and again, a game that's not featuring live players. It's featuring fans that are involved. And you just sort of have to prepare for it in a similar way to the game in terms of identifying people and how to do that as quickly as possible. But it's fun. The main thing for me is I need to hear the crowd. I need to get a sense of that. So what I did was I had a recording of the game as I was calling it. In other words, I wasn't calling it as it was being generated by the computer. The game was already done. And
Okay.
then I was able to do that. And the crowd had reaction. I had that in my earphones. So I was able to sort of play off of that. And, Dustin Lamandola and the entire digital team do such a great job of piecing all of that together. But I would just do it right here at a quiet spot at my house and send it off, and we edited it all together, and away we went. And it's been fun. It's been a good experience, and I really have enjoyed the interactions too that we've had. So many from so many different people around the world who really are enjoying that. It's definitely not the NHL. It's not the real San Jose Sharks, but it's been a fun process.
It's absolutely been fun, and to hear you call games uh, in May during when with no, I don't want to say real hockey going on, but to hear that it's always grateful, and I'm especially grateful for everything you've done with us and on Teal Town, and personally, I think we go back to days of when I would instant message you on AOL Instant Messenger. So I appreciate everything you've done for the Sharks. So thank you, Dan Rusanowsky, for this. I appreciate it, and can't wait to get back to the tank and hear your voice during some hockey games very soon.
I couldn't agree with you more, Eric. Thanks a lot for all that you guys do out there for us. Great job with the show, and everybody that's watching or listening. We look forward to having Sharks hockey come back better than ever for 2021, and that's going to be the story. When it starts, we'll find out soon, but maybe not soon, but hopefully sooner than later. And all in all, I can say keep a positive attitude, keep smiling. Thanks a lot for listening to our historic broadcast and for taking part in the virtual games and all of the other activities we've got planned. It's been a great process, and let's not forget about the fact we can use this time to make sure that we spend time with our families and express our love for them and understanding. And I think that we're all going to be better for it. So I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to the resumption of the season. We've got a couple of Sharks, Brendan Dillon in Washington, Barclay Goodrow in Tampa Bay, and Patrick Marleau in Pittsburgh that have a chance to maybe win a Stanley Cup this year. And I know that the guys on the Sharks that aren't playing are rooting for those guys to do well. And so that'll be interesting as well. So there's a lot to look forward to, and I'm really looking forward to the upcoming season with Sharks hockey.
Yeah, it's the former Shark. I think at least, well, now that it's 24 teams, I think what a third have Sharks ties to it at least. So it'll be
Right. Well, sure, sure.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see which one probably raises the cup. So, but again, Dan, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric.